The waitress approached the millionaire and told him not to board his private jet with his wife. The next morning, there was a helicopter and 3 men in black near her humble home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of the Magnolia House, Chicago's most exclusive café nestled in the heart of the Gold Coast. Grace Rivera moved with practiced efficiency between the mahogany tables, her worn sneakers silent against the expensive flooring at 28. She had perfected the art of being invisible, a skill that served her well in a place where she earned in a month what some customers spent on a single lunch. "Grace, table 7 needs their usual," called Marcus, the head waiter, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd worked here twice as long as anyone else. "On it," she replied, her hands already reaching for the silver serving tray. Table 7 meant the Hendersons, old money from Lake Forest who tipped exactly 15% and never made eye contact. Grace preferred them to the tech millionaires who treated her like a servant or the politicians' wives who spoke about her as if she couldn't hear. The cafe hummed with the low murmur of power lunches and business deals. Crystal chandeliers threw prismatic light across oil paintings that cost more than most people's cars. Grace had learned to appreciate the beauty, while never forgetting it wasn't meant for her. This was her stage, not her world. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. A text from St. Mary's Hospital. "Payment overdue. Please contact billing immediately." Grace's chest tightened. Her mother's dialysis treatments were bleeding her dry, but missing even one session wasn't an option. Helen Rivera had raised Grace alone after her father died in a construction accident when she was 12. Now it was Grace's turn to be the strong one. "Excuse me, miss." A gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. Grace looked up to see Mrs. Patterson, one of the cafe's regular customers, gesturing toward an empty table by the window. "Could you seat my guests when they arrive? They should be here any minute." "Of course." "Mrs. Patterson, same table as always. Actually, could we have the corner booth? It's more private." Mrs. Patterson's eyes sparkled with the kind of excitement that came from knowing something others didn't. "I'm expecting quite the conversation today." Grace nodded and began preparing the corner booth, arranging the bone china and sterling silver with the precision that had kept her employed here for 3 years. The Magnolia House didn't tolerate mistakes, and Grace couldn't afford to lose this job. Every dollar went toward her mother's medical bills, their tiny apartment's rent, and the growing pile of pharmacy receipts that haunted her nightmares. The cafe's atmosphere shifted when Richard Caldwell walked through the door, even without knowing his name. Anyone could see he belonged here. His Italian suit probably cost more than Grace made in 6 months, and he moved with the confidence of someone who'd never had to check his bank balance before making a purchase. Behind him walked another man, slightly shorter, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of tired eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "Mr. Caldwell." Marcus appeared instantly, his demeanor shifting into the particular blend of respect and servility reserved for the cafe's most important patrons. "Your usual table is ready. Actually, we'll take the corner booth today. Marcus, Daniel, and I need to discuss some private matters." Richard's voice carried the easy authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Grace felt a flutter of nervousness. She'd prepared that booth for Mrs. Patterson, but one look at Marcus's face told her everything she needed to know. Richard Caldwell didn't make requests. He made statements that others rearranged their lives to accommodate. "Of course, sir. Grace will take excellent care of you." As Grace approached their table, she caught fragments of their conversation. Richard was animated, gesturing with his hands as he spoke about private jets and tropical islands. His companion, Daniel, she'd heard, sat quietly, occasionally nodding, but never quite meeting his friend's eyes. "I can't believe Lauren agreed to 3 weeks in the Bahamas," Richard was saying. His face lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "She kept insisting we needed to stay close to her charity work, but I finally convinced her that our marriage deserves a proper honeymoon." Daniel managed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She's a lucky woman, Rich. You've got it all figured out." "We've got it all figured out," Richard corrected, reaching across to pat his friend's shoulder. "Caldwell Enterprises wouldn't be where it is without you, partner. Speaking of which, how are things with Sophie? Still giving you trouble about college?" Something flickered across Daniel's face. Pain, maybe, or fear. She's fine, teenagers. You know, always worried about their future." Grace set down their coffee cups with practiced silence. The Magnolia House had trained her well in the art of being present, but unnoticed. Rich people, she'd learned, often spoke more freely when they forgot the help was listening. Well, after this Bahamas deal closes, we'll both have more time for family, Richard continued, stirring sugar into his coffee. I've been thinking about expanding the resort chain. Maybe something in Costa Rica next. Sounds ambitious, Daniel replied, but his voice lacked enthusiasm. He kept glancing at his watch, and Grace noticed the way his hands shook slightly when he reached for his cup. You okay, man? You seem distracted lately. Just tired? Haven't been sleeping well? Grace moved to the next table, but she could still hear their conversation. There was something unsettling about the dynamic between the two men. Richard spoke with the boundless optimism of someone whose biggest worry was choosing between vacation destinations, while Daniel carried himself like a man bearing invisible weight. The jet's all fueled up and ready, Richard continued. Tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. sharp, we'll be wheels up for paradise. I can't wait to see Lauren's face when she sees the surprise I've planned for our first night. Daniel's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down. Tomorrow. You forgot, Dan. You helped me plan this whole thing, the resort, the dinner reservations, even the champagne selection. Are you sure you're feeling all right? I'm fine, just a lot on my mind with the quarterly reports. Daniel's voice was strained, and Grace noticed beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cafe's comfortable temperature. Grace refilled their water glasses, her movements automatic while her mind processed what she was observing. Something was wrong with this picture. Richard was clearly excited about his honeymoon trip, but Daniel looked like he was attending a funeral. The disconnect between their moods was striking. I should probably head back to the office, Daniel said, standing abruptly. Lots to wrap up before you're gone for 3 weeks. Hey, slow down, Richard laughed, catching his friend's arm. We barely touched our coffee. Besides, I wanted to talk to you about something important. Daniel sat back down reluctantly. What's on your mind? I've been thinking about our partnership agreement. When I get back from the Bahamas, I want to discuss giving you a bigger stake in the company. You've been my right hand for 15 years, Dan. It's time that was reflected in your ownership percentage. For a moment, Daniel's face crumpled with an emotion Grace couldn't quite identify. Guilt, grief, fear. Then he composed himself, forcing another hollow smile. That's very generous, Rich. Let's talk about it when you get back. I knew you'd be excited, Richard beamed, completely missing the anguish in his friend's eyes. Lauren thinks I'm crazy for mixing business with friendship, but she doesn't understand what we've built together. Grace felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. She'd served countless powerful men in this cafe, witnessed their deals and their dramas, but something about this conversation felt different. Dangerous, somehow. The two men finished their coffee in relative silence, Daniel checking his phone repeatedly while Richard scrolled through what looked like resort brochures. When they finally stood to leave, Grace noticed Daniel seemed unsteady on his feet. See you bright and early tomorrow, Richard said, embracing his friend. And Dan, thanks for everything. I know I don't say it enough, but you mean the world to me. Daniel returned the hug, but over Richard's shoulder, Grace saw his face contort with what looked like physical pain. Take care of yourself, Rich, You deserve all the happiness in the world, as they walked toward the exit. Grace began clearing their table, her hands moving mechanically while her mind raced. She'd witnessed something significant, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. The conversation had felt like a goodbye, but Richard clearly expected to see Daniel the next day. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of coffee refills and polite smiles, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just witnessed the calm before a storm. By the time she hung up her apron and headed home to her mother's dialysis appointment, one thought kept echoing in her mind. Something terrible was about to happen. She had no idea how right she was. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting different shadows across the Magnolia House's elegant interior. Grace moved through her routine with mechanical precision, but her mind kept drifting back to the strange interaction between Richard Caldwell and his business partner. Something about Daniel's behavior nagged at her. The way he'd trembled, the hollow look in his eyes, the goodbye that felt too final. Grace, you're wiping that same table for the 3rd time, Marcus observed, his tone carrying mild irritation. The Ashford party is arriving in 10 minutes, and table 12 still needs setup. Sorry, Marcus, on it right away. Grace forced herself to focus. Grabbing the necessary place settings, she couldn't afford to let her imagination run wild. especially not when her job depended on maintaining the cafe's impeccable standards. The Ashford party turned out to be a celebration of sorts, a successful merger that would apparently create synergies across multiple market segments, according to the gray-haired man who clearly loved the sound of his own voice. Grace served their champagne and canapes with practiced invisibility, her thoughts still churning. By 4 o'clock, the lunch crowd had thinned considerably. The Magnolia House operated on a precise schedule. Busy mornings with the power breakfast crowd, intense lunch service for the business elite, and quieter afternoons when the truly wealthy lingered over coffee and dessert. Grace preferred these slower hours. Less pressure, more time to think. She was refilling the sugar dispensers when she heard the familiar voice. Daniel Brooks had returned. Alone this time, and he looked even worse than he had that morning. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and there were dark circles under his eyes that seemed to have deepened in just a few hours. "Just coffee, Black," he told Marcus when offered a menu. "And I need a table where I can make some private calls." Marcus seated him at a corner table, the same booth where he'd sat with Richard earlier. Grace watched from across the room as Daniel pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed. "Sophie, it's Dad." His voice was barely above a whisper, but the cafe's acoustics carried it clearly to where Grace was working. "I know you're in class, but I just wanted to hear your voice." There was a long pause. Grace pretended to organize napkins while straining to listen. "No, sweetheart. Everything's fine. I'm just having one of those days, missing your mom." Another pause. "I love you too, baby. More than you'll ever know. Study hard, okay? Your future means everything to me." When he hung up, Daniel sat staring at his phone for several minutes. Grace noticed his hands were shaking more violently now, and she wondered if he was ill. The way he'd looked at Richard that morning, like he was seeing a ghost, suddenly made more sense. Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his face went white. After a moment's hesitation, he answered, "Yeah, I'm here." His voice was tight, controlled. Is it done?" Grace's blood ran cold. There was something in his tone that made her skin crawl. She moved closer, ostensibly to clean a nearby table, but really to hear better. "Good. The timeline hasn't changed." A pause. "Tomorrow at 3:30, I understand." Another pause, longer this time. "And it'll look like an accident." Grace's hands froze on the table she was wiping. An accident. Tomorrow at 3:30. Her mind raced back to the morning's conversation. Richard's excited talk about his honeymoon flight, scheduled for exactly that time. "No, I don't want to know the details," Daniel continued, his voice barely audible. "Just make sure it's clean. No one else gets hurt." The person on the other end must have said something reassuring, because Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly. "The payment will be transferred as soon as it's confirmed. We agreed on 50,000, right?" He paused, listening. "Fine, 75. But I want your word that it looks natural. Equipment failure, pilot error, whatever. Just not deliberate." Grace felt like she couldn't breathe. This couldn't be what it sounded like. Daniel was talking about an accident. A payment, a timeline that perfectly matched Richard's flight schedule. Her rational mind searched for alternative explanations, but they all felt forced and inadequate. "One more thing," Daniel said, his voice growing even quieter. "If anything goes wrong, if there's any chance this traces back to me, my daughter knows nothing. She's innocent in all this. Whatever happens to me, she gets protected. That's non-negotiable." Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd stumbled onto something terrible, something that could destroy lives. But what could she do? Who would believe a waitress accusing a wealthy businessman of what, exactly? Murder. Daniel ended the call and immediately dialed another number. This time, his voice was different, warmer, more normal. "Hey, it's me. How are you feeling today?" A pause. "That's good. The new medication is helping then." Another pause. "I'm glad. Listen, I need to talk to Dr. Martinez about adjusting my treatment schedule. I might need to take a few weeks off." Grace realized he was talking to a doctor or nurse about his own medical treatment. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a horrifying picture. Daniel was sick, possibly dying, and somehow that connected to whatever he was planning for Richard. "I understand the risks of interrupting the chemotherapy," Daniel continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But I need to handle some Personal business first. Family stuff. Chemotherapy. Cancer. Grace's stomach dropped. Daniel was dying, and somehow that was connected to his plans for Richard's flight. She thought about the conversation from the morning. Richard's excitement about their business partnership, his plans to give Daniel a bigger stake in the company, the way Daniel had looked like he was attending a funeral. "I'll call you back tomorrow evening," Daniel said, "after everything is settled." When he hung up, he buried his face in his hands. Grace watched as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. Whatever he was planning, it was tearing him apart. She wanted to approach him, to ask if he was okay, but something held her back. The phone calls she'd overheard weren't meant for her ears. This was dangerous territory, and she had her own family to protect. Daniel composed himself, left money on the table, and walked toward the exit. As he passed Grace, he stopped. "Miss, I don't think we've been formally introduced. I'm Daniel Brooks." He extended his hand, and Grace noticed how cold and clammy it was. "Grace Rivera, sir. It's nice to meet you." "Grace." He repeated her name thoughtfully. "That's a beautiful name. It means unmerited favor, divine blessing. Do you believe in grace, Miss Rivera?" The question caught her off guard. I try to, sir." "Good. Hold on to that faith. Sometimes it's all we have." He paused, studying her face. "You seem like a good person, Grace. Someone who cares about others." "I try to be, sir. If you ever found yourself in a position where you could help someone, even if it was dangerous, even if it might cost you everything, would you do it?" Grace felt like he was looking straight through her. I think I would, sir. If someone's life was in danger?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I thought so. You have kind eyes." He paused at the door. "Take care of yourself, Grace Rivera. And if you ever hear something that doesn't seem right, something that might hurt innocent people, trust your instincts." With that cryptic statement, he left. Grace stood frozen by the table, her mind reeling. Had he known she was listening? Was he warning her or threatening her? She spent the rest of her shift in a daze, going through the motions of service while her thoughts churned. By the time she clocked out, she'd made a decision. She had to warn Richard Caldwell. Even if it meant risking everything, the question was, would he believe her? Grace's hands trembled as she untied her apron in the staff room. The familiar routine of ending her shift felt surreal after what she'd overheard. Other employees chatted about weekend plans and upcoming shifts, their voices creating a normal backdrop that made her secret knowledge feel even more isolating. "You okay, Grace?" asked Maria, another waitress who'd been working at the Magnolia House for nearly a decade. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," Grace managed, forcing a smile. "Long day." Maria nodded sympathetically. "Tell me about it, Mrs. Henley complained about her soup being too hot, then complained when we brought her a new bowl that it was too cold, some people." She shook her head and gathered her things. "See you tomorrow." "Yeah, see you tomorrow." The words felt hollow. Grace wondered if there would be a tomorrow for any of them, or if the events she'd witnessed would somehow unravel everything. She lingered in the staff room until most of the other employees had left. Through the small window, she could see the main dining area where Marcus was overseeing the evening shift change. The cafe would stay open until 9, serving lighter fare and expensive wines to the after-work crowd. Grace's phone buzzed. Another text from St. Mary's Hospital. This time it was an automated reminder about her mother's dialysis appointment tomorrow at noon. The mundane reality of her own life crashed back into focus. Her mother was depending on her, counting on the steady income from this job to pay for treatments that kept her alive. But someone else was depending on her too, even if he didn't know it yet. She made her decision. Grace walked back into the dining area, her heart hammering against her ribs. Richard Caldwell sat at his usual table, alone this time, reading something on his tablet while nursing a glass of what looked like expensive scotch. His earlier excitement about the honeymoon had been replaced by a more serious demeanor as he scrolled through what appeared to be business documents. "Mr. Caldwell." Grace approached his table, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, surprised. "Yes, Grace, isn't it? Is everything all right?" "Sir, She glanced around the cafe, noting the other patrons and staff members within earshot. "Could I speak with you privately? It's very important." Richard frowned. setting down his tablet. "I'm sorry, but I'm not really in the habit of discussing personal matters with—" "Please." The desperation in her voice stopped him mid-sentence. "It's about your flight tomorrow. Your life might be in danger." The words hung in the air between them. Richard's expression shifted from mild annoyance to sharp attention. He studied her face for a long moment, clearly trying to determine if she was serious or simply seeking attention. "Sit down," he said finally, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Tell me what this is about." Grace sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. "This afternoon, Mr. Brooks came back to the café alone. He made some phone calls, and I couldn't help but overhear. Daniel made phone calls, and he was talking about tomorrow at 3:30, about making something look like an accident, about equipment failure." The words tumbled out in a rush. He mentioned a payment. $75,000 for something that has to happen tomorrow at exactly the time of your flight. Richard's face went very still. That's quite an accusation you're making. I know how it sounds, sir. I know you have no reason to trust me. But I heard what I heard, and I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you and your wife when I could have prevented it. You're suggesting that Daniel, my best friend since college, my business partner for 15 years, is trying to kill me. I'm suggesting that something isn't right. He looked sick this morning, really sick, and he was talking about chemotherapy, about taking time off treatment to handle personal business. He seemed— Grace searched for the right words. He seemed like a man who was running out of time. Richard leaned back in his chair, his scotch forgotten. Daniel has been acting strangely lately. Distracted, nervous, but planning my murder, that's— He shook his head. It's impossible. Is it impossible? Or is it just unthinkable? The question hit its mark. Richard's confident denial wavered slightly. "Why would you tell me this?" he asked. "What do you gain from making such a serious accusation?" "Nothing, sir. I gain nothing. In fact, I'm probably about to lose everything." Grace's voice steadied with resolve. "But I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent and innocent people died." Before Richard could respond, a familiar voice interrupted them. "Grace, what are you doing here? I thought your shift ended an hour ago." They both turned to see Daniel Brooks approaching their table. Grace's blood turned to ice. How long had he been there? How much had he heard? "Daniel," Richard said, his voice carefully neutral. "I was just having a drink before heading home," Grace was, telling me about the new seasonal menu. Daniel's eyes moved between them, and Grace felt like he could see straight through the lie. "The seasonal menu, right?" He pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. "Mind if I join you? I could use a drink after the day I've had." "Of course," Richard said, but Grace noticed the tension in his shoulders. Daniel signaled the waiter and ordered a bourbon. Neat, while they waited for his drink. He studied Grace with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You know, Grace, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. About trust, about doing the right thing even when it's dangerous." His voice was pleasant, conversational, but there was something underneath it that made Grace's stomach clench. "Have you had a chance to think about what we discussed?" "I'm not sure I understand, sir." "About helping people, about speaking up when you see something wrong." Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's a big responsibility, isn't it? Making decisions that could affect other people's lives." Richard looked between them, clearly sensing the undercurrent, but not understanding it. "What conversation is this?" "Oh, just some philosophical discussion about moral courage," Daniel said lightly. "Grace struck me as someone with strong convictions, the kind of person who would risk everything to do what she believes is right." The waiter brought Daniel's bourbon, and he took a slow sip, never taking his eyes off Grace. "Of course, sometimes people misunderstand situations. They think they're helping when they're actually causing harm. Good intentions can lead to terrible consequences." Grace felt trapped. Every word felt like a veiled threat, but she couldn't prove anything. Richard was watching the exchange with growing confusion, and what might have been suspicion. "I think there might be some confusion here," Richard said carefully. "Grace, perhaps you should head home. I'm sure you have other responsibilities." "Yes," Daniel agreed, his voice silk smooth. "Family is so important. I'm sure your mother is waiting for you, Mrs. Helen, isn't it? Such a lovely woman. It would be terrible if anything happened to disrupt her treatment." The threat was unmistakable now. Grace's heart pounded as she realized Daniel knew exactly who she was, where she lived, and what mattered most to her. He'd done his homework. "I should go," Grace said, standing on unsteady legs. "But Mr. Caldwell, please think about what I said, about being careful." "I will," Richard said, his eyes now studying Daniel with new interest. "Thank you for telling me about the seasonal menu." As Grace walked away, she heard Daniel's voice behind her. "You know, Rich, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, about the partnership, about the future. I think we should talk more when you get back from your honeymoon." "Actually," Richard said, and Grace heard something new in his voice, a note of caution that hadn't been there before. "I think we should talk now, tonight, about a lot of things." Grace reached the exit, her heart hammering. She'd done it. She'd planted the seed of doubt in Richard's mind. Whether it would be enough to save his life remained to be seen. As she stepped into the Chicago evening, she realized there was no going back. She'd chosen a side in a deadly game, and now she had to live with the consequences. Behind her, through the cafe's windows, she could see the two men sitting across from each other, their body language tense and wary. The conversation that would determine whether she'd saved a life or destroyed her own was just beginning. Grace's small apartment felt like a prison cell as she paced the worn carpet, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. The faded walls seemed to close in around her, and every sound from the hallway made her jump. She'd been home for 3 hours, but sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's cold smile and heard his veiled threats about her mother. "Mija, you're making me dizzy with all that walking back and forth," Helen Rivera said from her position on the old couch. Even with her illness, Grace's mother had an uncanny ability to read her daughter's moods. "What's got you so worked up?" "Nothing, Mommy. Just thinking about work stuff." Grace forced herself to sit down, but her leg bounced nervously. She couldn't tell her mother the truth, that she'd potentially saved a stranger's life while putting both of them in danger. Helen reached over and took her daughter's hand, her touch weak but warm. "You know, when you were little, you used to pace like this before thunderstorms. You could always sense them coming before anyone else." Grace squeezed her mother's frail fingers. "Maybe there's a storm coming tonight. Then we'll weather it together. Just like we always do." Helen's smile was tired but genuine. "Your father used to say that Rivera women are stronger than any storm." The mention of her father made Grace's chest tighten. Miguel Rivera had died trying to save a coworker who'd fallen from scaffolding. He'd managed to push the other man to safety but couldn't save himself. Grace had inherited his sense of justice, his inability to stand by when others were in danger. It was both a blessing and a curse. Her phone buzzed, and Grace nearly jumped out of her skin. Unknown number. "Hello? Grace Rivera." The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "Yes. This is James Morrison from Caldwell Enterprises. Mr. Caldwell asked me to call you. He needs to speak with you urgently about a matter you discussed earlier today." Grace's mouth went dry. What time is it?" "Nearly midnight. I apologize for the late hour, but Mr. Caldwell insisted this couldn't wait. He's arranged for a car to pick you up. It should arrive in 10 minutes. A car, I don't think. Miss Rivera, Mr. Caldwell wanted me to tell you that he's taken your concerns very seriously. He's currently investigating the matter you brought to his attention, and he needs additional information from you. This is about protecting innocent lives." Grace looked at her mother, who had dozed off on the couch. "I can't leave my mother alone. The car will wait while you make arrangements. Mr. Caldwell emphasizes that time is of the essence." After hanging up, Grace gently shook her mother awake. "Mommy, I need to go out for a little while. Mrs. Santos next door said she'd check on you if I ever needed anything." Helen's eyes were clearer now, more alert. "Grace, what's happening? You look scared." "I'm not scared, just I might have gotten involved in something at work, something important. I need to help someone, like your father would have done." "Yes, like Papa would have done." Helen struggled to sit up straighter. "Then you go. But Mija, promise me you'll be careful. Some storms are too big for one person to handle alone." Grace kissed her mother's forehead, inhaling the familiar scent of her lavender soap, mixed with the sterile smell of medications. "I promise Mrs. Santos will be here in 5 minutes." The black sedan that arrived was the kind of car Grace had only seen in movies. Sleek, expensive, with tinted windows that hid its occupants. The driver was professional but not talkative, and Grace spent the 20-minute ride through Chicago's late-night streets, wondering if she was making a terrible mistake. They didn't go to Caldwell Enterprises' downtown headquarters. Instead, the car pulled up to a modern glass building in a business district Grace didn't recognize. The driver led her through a lobby filled with abstract art and up to the 15th floor. Richard Caldwell was waiting in what appeared to be a conference room, but he wasn't alone. 2 other men in suits flanked him, and Grace noticed security cameras in every corner. "Grace, thank you for coming. I know this is unusual, but after our conversation today, I had to take immediate action." Richard's face was grave, older looking than it had been that afternoon. "These gentlemen are from my private security firm. They've been investigating the claims you made about Daniel." Grace's heart hammered. "What did you find?" "Enough to take your warnings seriously. We've discovered some irregularities in the company's financial records. Large cash withdrawals from accounts Daniel has access to, and there's more." Richard paused, studying her face. "My private jet has been in Daniel's care for the past week. He insisted on overseeing the pre-flight maintenance personally." One of the security men, a stern-faced individual with graying temples, stepped forward. "Miss Rivera, we need you to tell us everything you heard this afternoon. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem." Grace recounted Daniel's phone calls, his mention of the 3:30 timing, the payment discussion, his conversation about chemotherapy. The security team took notes, occasionally asking for clarification about specific phrases or tones of voice. "The individual he spoke with," the security chief said. "Did he mention any names?" "No, but," Grace hesitated, "he called someone Wrench at one point. I thought it was strange." The 2 security men exchanged glances. "Ethan Carter," one of them said to Richard, "goes by Wrench. He's a known associate of several criminal organizations. Specializes in making accidents look accidental." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "So it's true. Daniel is really trying to kill Mr. Caldwell." "It appears so," Richard said quietly. "The question is why. Daniel and I have been friends for decades. He's godfather to my sister's children. He was my best man at my wedding last month. He's dying," Grace said softly. "The chemotherapy calls, the way he looked. I think he's running out of time. But why would that make him want to kill me?" The security chief cleared his throat. "We've discovered that Mr. Brooks recently accessed your life insurance policy information. The beneficiary was changed 3 weeks ago from your wife to Mr. Brooks's daughter, Sophie. The policy is worth $50 million. But there's a clause. It only pays out in case of accidental death." The room fell silent. Grace watched Richard's face cycle through disbelief, hurt, and anger. "Sophie," Richard whispered. "He's doing this for Sophie. A desperate father trying to secure his daughter's future." The security chief agreed. "It's more common than you'd think. Terminal illness can drive people to extreme measures." "What happens now?" Grace asked. "Now we stop him," Richard said, his voice hardening. "We're going to let Daniel think his plan is working. The jet has been thoroughly inspected. We found and removed an explosive device from the fuel system. Tomorrow, we'll go through the motions of the flight, but we'll be ready for him." Grace felt a chill. "What about his accomplice? This Wrench person? Already in custody. We picked him up an hour ago. He's been very cooperative in exchange for a reduced sentence. And Daniel will be arrested tomorrow after he thinks the plan has been executed. We need to catch him in the act of expecting payment, trying to collect on the insurance policy." Grace nodded, but she felt sick. "What about his daughter? Sophie doesn't know anything about this." "No, she doesn't, and she never will if we can help it." Richard's expression softened slightly. "Despite everything, Daniel was once like a brother to me. I won't destroy his daughter's life unless absolutely necessary." The security chief stood. "Miss Rivera, we need to ask you to stay in protective custody tonight. If Mr. Brooks suspects you're involved in exposing him, you could be in danger." "I can't. My mother needs me. She's alone and sick. We've already arranged for medical supervision at your apartment. A private nurse will stay with her until this is resolved." Grace felt overwhelmed. In less than 24 hours, her simple life had been turned upside down. "I just wanted to do the right thing." "You did. Richard said firmly. "Grace, you saved my life and my wife's life. You also saved Daniel from committing a murder that would have destroyed what's left of his soul, whatever happens tomorrow. You should know that you're a hero." But as Grace was escorted to a secure hotel room for the night, she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who'd stumbled into a nightmare and wasn't sure she'd ever find her way out. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight brought only questions and the terrible weight of knowing that sometimes doing the right thing meant watching people you pitied destroy themselves. Grace barely slept in the sterile hotel room, her mind churning with images of explosions and betrayal. Every hour, she called to check on her mother, relieved to hear the night nurse's reassuring voice confirming that Helen was resting peacefully. But peace felt like a luxury Grace couldn't afford. Not when she knew what was coming. At 7 a.m., her phone rang. Richard Caldwell's voice was tight with exhaustion and determination. "Grace, we need you at the airfield. Daniel's already there, supervising the final preparations for the flight. We want you to see this through. You're the one who started this. And you deserve to see it end. Is it safe? Safer than staying alone. We have the entire area under surveillance. Daniel doesn't know we've discovered everything." An hour later, Grace found herself in the back of another black sedan, this time heading toward a private airfield on the outskirts of Chicago. The morning sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, a beautiful backdrop for what promised to be an ugly confrontation. The airfield was busier than Grace had expected. Richard's jet sat on the tarmac like a gleaming silver bird, surrounded by maintenance crews and security personnel disguised as regular airport workers. Through the sedan's tinted windows, she could see Daniel Brooks standing near the aircraft, clipboard in hand, playing his part perfectly. "He looks so normal," Grace whispered to the security chief sitting beside her. "Like he's just doing his job." "That's what makes him dangerous," the man replied. "He genuinely believes he's doing the right thing for his daughter. In his mind, he's not a murderer. He's a desperate father." They parked in a hangar about 50 yards away, close enough to observe but far enough to stay hidden. Grace watched through binoculars as Daniel moved around the jet with practiced efficiency, checking various systems and speaking with the ground crew. To anyone watching, he looked like a conscientious business partner, ensuring his friend's safety. The device he planted was sophisticated, the security chief explained quietly, designed to cause catastrophic engine failure about 30 minutes into the flight. It would have looked like mechanical failure, no evidence of sabotage. Grace shuddered. How can someone plan something like that and still sleep at night? Terminal cancer changes people. The knowledge that you're dying, that your time is limited. It can make ordinary people do extraordinary things. Not always good things. At 10 a.m., Richard arrived at the airfield with his new wife, Lauren. Even from a distance, Grace could see the excitement on Lauren's face as she admired the jet that was supposed to carry them to their dream honeymoon. She looked radiant in her designer travel outfit. Completely unaware of how close she'd come to death, Daniel greeted them with what appeared to be genuine warmth. He embraced Richard like the old friend he'd once been, and Grace noticed him linger a moment longer than necessary, as if memorizing the feeling. "God, he really loves him," Grace murmured. "You can see it in his face. That's what makes this so tragic." Richard's voice came through the communication device Grace wore. "He's not just betraying me, he's betraying himself. Everything he used to stand for." Through the binoculars, Grace watched Daniel help Lauren board the jet, his manner courteous and protective. He showed her the safety features, the emergency exits, the communication systems. The irony was heartbreaking. He was explaining how to survive the very disaster he'd planned to cause. "Final systems check complete," Daniel announced to Richard. "Everything's perfect for your trip. Thanks. Partner, I don't know what I'd do without you watching my back." Daniel's face flickered with something. Guilt, regret, pain. "Rich, I want you to know, whatever happens, our friendship meant everything to me. You've been like a brother. You're talking like you're never going to see me again." Richard laughed, but Grace could hear the strain in his voice. "It's just 3 weeks. We'll be back before you know it." "Right, 3 weeks." Daniel stepped back from the jet. "Have a wonderful time. Both of you deserve all the happiness in the world." The jet's engines began to spool up, and Grace felt her heart rate increase even though she knew the truth. This was all theater, a carefully choreographed performance to catch Daniel in the act. but watching it unfold felt surreal, like being inside a movie where she knew the ending but couldn't shake the tension. "Flight crew is reporting ready for departure," came a voice over the radio. "Passengers secured." "All systems green." Daniel walked to the observation area, pulling out his phone. Grace watched him dial a number, his hands trembling slightly. "It's me," he said into the phone. "They're taking off now. Everything should be resolved within the hour." Grace realized he was talking to someone about the insurance payout. Probably a lawyer or financial advisor who thought they were discussing a legitimate claim. The web of deception ran deeper than she'd imagined. The jet began to taxi toward the runway. Lauren waved excitedly from one of the windows, and Richard gave Daniel a thumbs up. To anyone watching, it looked like a perfect send-off for a honeymoon flight. But Grace knew the jet would never leave the ground. As soon as it was out of Daniel's sight, it would return to a different hangar where Richard and Lauren would disembark safely. The real confrontation was yet to come. "How long do we wait?" Grace asked. "About an hour," the security chief replied. Long enough for Daniel to think the plan worked. They watched Daniel drive away from the airfield, probably returning to his office to establish an alibi. The waiting began. Grace spent the time thinking about the complexity of human nature. Daniel wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a man driven to desperate measures by love and fear. She found herself oddly sympathetic to his situation, even while knowing he had to be stopped. At 4:30 p.m., exactly 1 hour after the planned explosion time, Daniel's phone rang. Grace watched through the surveillance feed as he answered, his face pale with anticipation. "Yes." The voice on the other end was actually one of Richard's security team. Disguised. "It's done. Catastrophic engine failure at 30,000 feet. No survivors. It's already being reported as a tragic accident." Daniel's face crumpled. For a moment, Grace thought he might change his mind, might confess everything and try to undo what he'd done. But then his expression hardened with resolve. "And the insurance?" "Clean as a whistle. Your daughter will never want for anything." "Good. That's good." When Daniel hung up, he sat in his car for several minutes, his head in his hands. Grace watched him cry for the friend he believed he'd killed, and she felt her own tears flowing. "Now," Richard said through the radio. "Move in now." Police cars surrounded Daniel's vehicle from all directions. Grace watched as officers approached with weapons drawn, their movements careful and professional. Daniel didn't resist. He simply sat there, looking older than his years, as they placed him under arrest. "Daniel Brooks, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent." The words echoed across the airfield as Grace watched a man's life collapse in real time. She felt no satisfaction in his capture, only a deep sadness for the waste of it all. "It's over," Richard said, appearing beside her. "Grace, it's finally over." But looking at Daniel's broken form being led away in handcuffs, Grace knew it wasn't over. It was just beginning, the real reckoning. With conscience, with consequences, with the terrible price of desperate love, was still to come. Grace sat in the back of the sedan, watching the Chicago skyline blur past the tinted windows. The events of the past 24 hours felt like a fever dream. Had she really helped prevent a murder? Had she really brought down a man she'd served coffee to just yesterday? The weight of it all pressed down on her chest like a physical force. "Where are we going?" she asked the security chief, who'd been unusually quiet since Daniel's arrest. "Mr. Caldwell wants to speak with you. He has something important to discuss." Grace's stomach clenched. "Am I in trouble? Did I do something wrong?" "Miss Rivera, you saved lives yesterday. You're not in trouble." But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change dramatically. She thought of her mother, alone in their small apartment with the private nurse Richard had arranged. Helen would be wondering where her daughter was, worrying in the way only mothers could. The sedan pulled up to a residential area Grace didn't recognize. Tree-lined streets with houses that looked like they belonged in magazines. They stopped in front of a modest 2-story home with a well-maintained garden and a small porch swing. "This isn't Mr. Caldwell's house," Grace observed. "No, it's not." Before she could ask more questions, the front door opened. Grace's heart nearly stopped. Her mother stood in the doorway, looking healthier than she had in months, supported by a woman in medical scrubs. "Mommy!" Grace stumbled out of the car, her legs unsteady. "What are you doing here? How did you—" Mija? Helen's face lit up with a smile that reached her eyes. Come inside. There's someone you need to meet. Grace ran to her mother. Embracing her carefully, Helen felt stronger, more solid than she had in weeks. Mommy, I don't understand. What's happening? Your young man explained everything, Helen said, leading her daughter toward the house. About how brave you were, how you saved lives. I'm so proud of you, Grace. My young man. What young man? They entered the house, and Grace gasped. The interior was beautiful but comfortable. Hardwood floors, warm lighting, and furniture that looked both expensive and lived in. But what stopped her cold was the sight of Richard Caldwell standing in the living room, still wearing his business suit but looking somehow different. Humbled. Grace? He said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for coming. Mr. Caldwell, I don't understand. Why is my mother here? Where are we? This is my guest house, Richard explained. I brought your mother here because what I have to say is too important for a hospital room or a café. It requires privacy, and it requires witnesses. He gestured for them to sit on the comfortable couch. Grace helped her mother settle, noticing how much more alert Helen seemed. The private nurse, introduced as Karen, hovered nearby with a warm smile. Grace, yesterday you made a choice that changed everything. You could have stayed silent, kept your head down, protected yourself and your family. Instead, you risked everything to save the lives of people you barely knew. I just did what anyone would do. No, Richard's voice was firm but gentle. Most people would have convinced themselves they misheard, or that it wasn't their business, or that they might be wrong. You didn't. You acted on your conscience even when it was dangerous. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. I was terrified. I thought Daniel might hurt us. He might have. That's what makes your courage so extraordinary. Richard paused, seeming to gather himself. Grace, I want to repay you for what you did. But more than that, I want to make sure you never have to choose between doing the right thing and taking care of your family again. I don't understand. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Your mother needs a kidney transplant. The waiting list is years long, and the cost is astronomical. But I have connections, resources. Mrs. Rivera, if you'll allow me, I'd like to arrange for your surgery to happen within the month. The best surgeons, the best facility, everything paid for. Grace's world tilted. That's impossible. Transplants don't work that way. You can't just... Actually, you can. When you have enough money and the right connections, you can move mountains. I've already spoken with the transplant team at Northwestern Memorial. They have a donor match for your mother, and they're standing by. Helen reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. Mija, he's serious. The doctors came to see me this morning. They ran tests, explained everything. I could have the surgery next week. Grace felt like she couldn't breathe. But the cost is irrelevant, Richard said simply. Grace, you saved my life. You saved my wife's life. Money is just numbers on a screen. Life is what matters. I can't accept this. It's too much. Then let me tell you about the rest of it. Richard opened the folder. I'm offering you a full scholarship to Northwestern University, business administration with a focus on ethics and corporate responsibility. You'll graduate debt-free, and when you're ready, there will be a position waiting for you at Caldwell Enterprises. Grace stared at him, speechless. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a career, a future, the kind of opportunities that your character and courage deserve. Richard's voice grew more passionate. Grace, I've spent my entire adult life surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear. Yesterday, a waitress I'd never really noticed risked everything to tell me a truth that could have destroyed her life. That's the kind of integrity I want in my company. But I don't know anything about business. You know about right and wrong. You know about loyalty, courage, and putting others before yourself. Everything else can be taught. Grace looked at her mother, who was crying openly now. Mommy, what do you think? I think God sent you an angel, Helen whispered. And I think your father would be proud of the woman you've become. There's one more thing, Richard said quietly. Daniel's daughter, Sophie, she's 17, about to start her senior year of high school. She has no idea what her father was planning, and she shouldn't have to pay for his mistakes. Grace felt her heart clench. What about her? I'm setting up a trust fund for her education and future. She'll never want for anything. But she'll also never know the truth about why her father went to prison. As far as she's concerned, he was convicted of embezzlement, a white-collar crime that won't destroy her image of him. That's very generous. It's what you would do, Richard said simply. You showed me that sometimes the greatest strength is in protecting the innocent, even when they're connected to people who've wronged you. Grace sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything. In the span of 48 hours, she'd gone from struggling to pay for her mother's dialysis to being offered a complete transformation of their lives. Why? She finally asked. Why do all this for me? Richard was quiet for a long moment. Because yesterday, I learned something about the difference between loyalty and integrity. Daniel was loyal to me for 15 years, but when tested, he chose betrayal. You owed me nothing, but you chose to act with integrity anyway. That's worth more than any amount of money. Grace felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. I need time to think. Of course. But Grace, your mother's surgery can't wait. Whatever you decide about the scholarship or the job, please let me help her. She raised an extraordinary daughter. She deserves to see that daughter's future unfold, as if summoned by his words. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the air outside. Grace looked through the window to see a medical helicopter landing on the large lawn behind the house. That's your ride to the hospital, Richard said. The surgical team is waiting. Grace's mother stood up, steadier than she'd been in months. Mija, sometimes miracles come in unexpected packages. Your father always said that doing the right thing opens doors you never knew existed. As they prepared to leave for the hospital, Grace felt a strange sense of completion. She'd started this journey as a waitress, trying to save enough money for her mother's treatment. Now she was walking toward a helicopter that would take them to a life-saving surgery, paid for by a man whose life she'd saved. Ready? Richard asked, offering his arm to help Helen. Grace looked at her mother, then at the man who just offered to change their lives forever. Ready, as they walked toward the helicopter. Grace thought about angels. Maybe they didn't always have wings. Maybe sometimes they wore business suits and owned helicopters. And maybe, just maybe, they sometimes wore waitress uniforms and had hearts brave enough to speak up when it mattered most. The surgical waiting room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital felt like a cathedral to Grace. Hushed voices, reverent silence, and the constant undercurrent of hope mixed with fear. She sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent, watching the city lights twinkle through floor-to-ceiling windows as Chicago settled into evening. The surgery is going beautifully, Dr. Sarah Chen announced as she entered the waiting room, still wearing her surgical scrubs. Your mother is responding perfectly to the new kidney. The donor match was exceptional, better than we could have hoped for. Grace felt her knees go weak with relief. She's going to be okay. More than okay, Mrs. Rivera should have a complete recovery, with proper care and medication. She could live a completely normal life for decades to come. Dr. Chen's smile was warm and genuine. You should be very proud. Your mother is a fighter. Can I see her? She's in recovery now, but she'll be awake soon. The anesthesia is wearing off nicely. Grace sank back into her chair, overwhelmed. Just this morning, she'd been a waitress whose biggest worry was making next month's rent. Now her mother was alive, truly alive, for the first time in years. Grace. Richard's voice was gentle as he approached. He'd been pacing the waiting room for the past 6 hours, as anxious as if Helen were his own mother. Good news, I hope. The best news, Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. She's going to be fine, Doctor. Chen says she'll have a normal life. Richard sat down beside her, and Grace was surprised to see moisture in his eyes as well. I'm so glad. Your mother is a remarkable woman. You stayed here the whole time. Where else would I be? You're both important to me now. Grace studied his face, looking for signs of the arrogant businessman she'd expected to find. Instead, she saw something she hadn't anticipated. Genuine care, the kind that couldn't be faked or bought. Why are you doing all this, really? Richard was quiet for a long moment. Because yesterday, I discovered that the person I trusted most in the world was willing to kill me for money, and I discovered that a stranger was willing to risk everything to save me. It made me realize how badly I'd been judging character. Daniel wasn't evil. He was desperate. I know, that's what makes it so tragic. Richard's voice grew heavy. I visited him in jail this afternoon. Before the surgery, he asked me to tell you something." Grace's heart clenched. "What did he say?" "He said he was sorry for threatening you and your mother. He said he knew you were just doing what was right, and he hoped you could forgive him someday." "Did you forgive him?" "I'm trying to. It's complicated. 15 years of friendship don't disappear overnight, even when they end in betrayal." Richard paused. "But I told him about the trust fund for Sophie," he cried. Grace felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. That poor girl, she has no idea what her father was going through. She doesn't need to know. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let people keep their illusions about the ones they love. A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Miss Rivera, your mother is awake and asking for you." Grace stood on shaky legs, Richard steadying her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "Want me to come with you?" "Yes. I think she'd like that." They walked through the hospital corridors, past rooms filled with hope and heartbreak. Grace marveled at how different everything looked now. The same building, but viewed through the lens of miraculous possibility instead of desperate fear. Helen Rivera lay in the hospital bed looking more alert than Grace had seen her in months. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes held a clarity that had been missing for far too long. "Mija," Helen said, reaching for her daughter's hand. I feel like myself again." Grace leaned down to kiss her mother's forehead. "How's the pain?" "What pain?" "I feel wonderful. Like I've been sleeping for years and finally woke up." Helen's gaze moved to Richard. "And you, young man, how can I ever thank you?" "You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Rivera. Your daughter saved my life. This is just returning the favor." Helen smiled, and Grace saw something in her mother's eyes she hadn't seen since before the illness began. "Mischief. You know, Mr. Caldwell. I think there's something you should know about my Grace." "Mommy, don't..." "She's been working 3 jobs to pay for my treatments, the cafe in the mornings, cleaning offices at night, and tutoring neighborhood kids on weekends. She hasn't had a day off in 2 years. Grace felt her cheeks burn. "Mommy, stop." "And she's smart, smarter than anyone knows. She was valedictorian of her high school class, got accepted to Northwestern on a partial scholarship, but she turned it down to take care of me." Richard looked at Grace with new understanding. "You gave up Northwestern to work as a waitress. It wasn't really a choice. Mommy needed me. It was a choice," Helen said firmly. "You chose love over ambition. You chose family over personal dreams. That's the kind of person you are, Grace." "Well," Richard said quietly, "it looks like Northwestern is getting a second chance with you." Dr. Chen reappeared with a chart in her hands. "Mrs. Rivera, I have wonderful news. Your kidney function is already improving dramatically. At this rate, you'll be able to go home in just a few days." "Home?" Grace's voice cracked. "To our apartment." "Actually," Richard interrupted gently, "I was hoping to discuss that with you both. The guest house where you met today, it's yours for as long as you need it. Your mother will need a quiet place to recover, somewhere without the stress of city noise and cramped quarters." Grace stared at him. "You want us to live in your guest house? I want you to have a place where you can focus on your mother's recovery and your own education, without worrying about rent or utilities or any of the practical concerns that might distract you from what's important." Helen squeezed her daughter's hand. "Grace, this man is offering you the life your father wanted you to have, the life you deserve. But it's too much. I can't." "You can," Richard said firmly. "And you will, because someone needs to teach my company what integrity looks like. Someone needs to show our employees that doing the right thing matters more than protecting yourself." Grace looked around the hospital room, at her mother, healthy and vibrant for the first time in years, at Richard, a man she'd misjudged as just another wealthy businessman, at the future that was suddenly, impossibly within reach. "What about Daniel?" she asked. "What happens to him?" "He'll serve his sentence, but he'll receive the best medical care available, and his daughter will never want for anything. Sometimes justice and mercy can coexist, and his daughter really won't know the truth. Sophie will know that her father made some poor financial decisions and is paying the price. She'll never know he was capable of murder. That's a mercy for everyone involved." Grace felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, one she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "I keep thinking this is all a dream, that I'll wake up tomorrow and be back to serving coffee and counting pills." "This isn't a dream," Helen said softly. "This is what happens when you have the courage to do the right thing, even when it's dangerous. Your father always said that the universe rewards genuine acts of bravery. Your father sounds like he was a wise man, Richard observed. He was. He died saving someone else's life. Grace's voice caught. I guess I learned from the best. As the evening wore on, Grace sat beside her mother's bed, watching her sleep peacefully for the first time in months. Richard had gone home to his wife, but not before ensuring that Grace had everything she needed, and a phone number to call him anytime, day or night. Looking out at the Chicago skyline, Grace thought about the strange turns life could take. 3 days ago, she'd been a struggling waitress with a sick mother and no prospects. Now she was looking at a future filled with education, purpose, and the kind of opportunities she'd only dreamed about. But most importantly, her mother was alive. Truly. Completely alive sometimes, Grace realized. Grace? Angels didn't need wings. Sometimes they just needed the courage to speak up when it mattered most. The Cook County Courthouse stood like a monument to justice in downtown Chicago, its imposing limestone facade casting long shadows across the busy street. Grace sat in the gallery, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching as Daniel Brooks was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. 3 weeks had passed since her mother's surgery, and Helen was recovering beautifully in the guest house that had become their temporary home. But today, Grace had insisted on being here for the sentencing. Daniel looked older, frailer than he had just a month ago. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his diminishing frame, and his once sharp business demeanor had been replaced by the hollow resignation of a man who'd lost everything that mattered. When his eyes found Grace in the gallery, he offered a small, sad smile that nearly broke her heart. The People versus Daniel Marcus Brooks, the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Patricia Martinez presiding. Judge Martinez was a stern woman in her 50s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see through pretense. She reviewed the case file with careful attention before addressing the courtroom. Mr. Brooks, you stand convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, insurance fraud, and embezzlement. Before I pass sentence, the court will hear victim impact statements. Mr. Caldwell, you may proceed. Richard stood from his seat at the prosecutor's table. He'd insisted on attending every hearing. Despite his lawyer's advice to stay away, he approached the podium with the same confidence he brought to boardrooms. But Grace could see the emotion beneath his composed exterior. Your Honor, Daniel Brooks was my best friend for 15 years. He was my business partner, my confidant, and someone I trusted with my life. Literally. As it turned out, Richard's voice was steady but heavy with disappointment. The betrayal I feel is indescribable, but what hurts most is knowing that he felt he couldn't come to me with his problems. If he'd told me about his cancer, about his fears for his daughter's future, we could have found another way. Richard paused, looking directly at Daniel. I want the court to know that while Mr. Brooks's actions were inexcusable, I believe they came from a place of desperation, not malice. He's a father who was dying and wanted to ensure his daughter's security. That doesn't excuse attempted murder, but it explains it. Judge Martinez nodded. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Are there any other impact statements? Grace felt her heart racing. She hadn't planned to speak, but something compelled her to stand. Your Honor, may I address the court? And you are. Grace Rivera, Your Honor. I'm the witness who overheard Mr. Brooks' plans and reported them to Mr. Caldwell. The judge consulted her notes. Ms. Rivera, you're not listed as a victim in this case. No, Your Honor, but I feel like I need to say something. Very well, please approach the podium. Grace walked to the front of the courtroom on unsteady legs, acutely aware of every eye upon her. She'd never spoken in a courtroom before, but she'd learned that sometimes the most important words came from the heart, not from preparation. Your Honor, I want to talk about Mr. Brooks' character. Yes, he planned something terrible. Yes, he was willing to kill his best friend for money, but Grace looked at Daniel, who was staring at her with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. He also asked his accomplice to make sure no one else got hurt. He specifically said he wanted Mrs. Caldwell protected, even in his darkest moment. He was trying to minimize the damage. Grace's voice grew stronger. And when he thought the plan had worked, when he believed his friend was dead, he cried, I saw him on the surveillance video. He mourned for Mr. Caldwell, even as he thought he was collecting insurance money. That tells me something about who he really is inside. What point are you trying to make? Miss Rivera, that Mr. Brooks isn't a monster, Your Honor. He's a man who made a terrible choice because he was dying and desperate. He deserves to be punished, but he also deserves our understanding. Grace returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She'd spoken the truth as she saw it, and that was all she could do. Mr. Brooks, Judge Martinez said, do you wish to address the court before sentencing? Daniel stood slowly, his lawyer helping him to his feet. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse but clear. Your Honor, I want to start by apologizing to Rich, to Mr. Caldwell. He trusted me with his life, and I betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. There's no excuse for what I did, no justification that makes it right. Daniel paused, composing himself. I also want to apologize to Mrs. Rivera. I threatened her and her sick mother because I was angry that she'd discovered my plan. She showed more courage and integrity in one day than I showed in months of planning. Mr. Brooks, the court would like to understand your motivation. You're a successful businessman with significant assets. Why resort to such extreme measures? Daniel's composure cracked. Because I'm dying, Your Honor. I have pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. My doctors give me 6 months, maybe less, and my daughter. Sophie is everything to me. She's 17, about to start college. She wants to be a doctor, like her mother was. Tears streamed down his face. I looked at my bank accounts, my investments, everything I'd built, and I realized it wouldn't be enough. Not for medical school, not for the life I wanted her to have. The insurance money would have guaranteed her future. So you decided to murder your best friend. I decided to sacrifice myself for her future. I know that sounds crazy, but in my mind, I was already dead. The cancer was going to kill me anyway, I thought. I thought if I could just ensure Sophie's security, maybe my death would mean something. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Daniel's quiet sobs. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the raw emotion of his confession. I never meant for it to become real, Daniel continued. I kept telling myself it was just planning, just preparation. But then the day came, and I couldn't stop it. Or I didn't want to stop it. I don't know anymore. Judge Martinez leaned forward. Mr. Brooks, did you consider simply asking Mr. Caldwell for help? He's testified that he would have assisted you and your daughter. I couldn't. Rich had already done so much for me over the years. He gave me a partnership in his company, made me wealthy beyond my dreams. How could I ask him to take care of my daughter too? It felt like admitting I'd failed as a father. So instead, you decided to kill him. Instead, I decided to die a failure and a murderer so my daughter could live as a success. Daniel's voice broke completely. I can see now how twisted that logic was. I can see how wrong I was about everything. Richard stood up in the gallery. Your Honor, may I say something? This is irregular, Mr. Caldwell, but given the circumstances, I'll allow it. Dan, you weren't a failure as a father. You were a man facing an impossible situation who made the wrong choice. But Sophie is going to be fine. I've set up a trust fund for her education and future. She'll never want for anything. Daniel collapsed back into his chair, overwhelmed. Rich, I don't deserve... No, you don't. But she does. And despite everything, you were my friend once. I won't let your daughter suffer for your mistakes. Judge Martinez restored order as emotional murmurs swept through the courtroom. Mr. Brooks, given the severity of your crimes, the court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison, however. I'm recommending that you serve your sentence at a facility with a comprehensive medical program, and that you receive all necessary treatment for your cancer. Additionally, I'm ordering that you participate in counseling, and that you write a letter to your daughter explaining your actions. She deserves to know the truth, even if it's painful. Daniel nodded, accepting the sentence with dignity. As he was led away, he turned back to look at Grace and Richard one last time. Thank you, he mouthed silently. Both of you. Grace felt tears on her cheeks as she watched him disappear through the courthouse doors. Justice had been served, but it felt more like tragedy than triumph. 6 months after the trial, Grace stood in the visiting room of the Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota, her hands nervously adjusting the visitor's badge clipped to her Northwestern University sweatshirt. The facility was more hospital than prison, With clean white walls and the constant hum of medical equipment, she'd been thinking about this visit for weeks, ever since receiving Daniel's letter asking if she'd come see him. "Are you sure about this?" Richard had asked when she'd told him about her plans. "You don't owe him anything, Grace. You've already shown more compassion than most people would." But Grace had learned that sometimes the hardest thing to do was also the right thing to do, and seeing Daniel Brooks again felt like unfinished business. A guard escorted her to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. Daniel entered a few minutes later. Moving slowly with the help of a walker, the cancer had progressed rapidly, and Grace was shocked by how much weight he'd lost. His once sharp business suit had been replaced by prison scrubs that hung loose on his diminished frame. "Grace," he said, settling carefully into the chair across from her. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. "But your letter, it sounded like you had something important to say." Daniel smiled, and for a moment, Grace saw a glimpse of the man he'd been before desperation had consumed him. "I do several things, actually. First, I want to thank you. Thank me for stopping me, for saving Rich's life, for saving me from becoming a murderer." His voice was weak but sincere. "I lie awake at night thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't overheard that phone call. I would have killed my best friend, and I would have had to live with that for whatever time I had left." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "You were desperate. You were dying and scared for your daughter." "I was a coward," Daniel corrected gently. "I was too proud to ask for help, and too afraid to face my mortality with dignity. You showed me what real courage looks like." "How is Sophie?" Grace asked, changing the subject. "Have you told her the truth?" Daniel's face lit up with pride, tinged with sadness. "She's thriving, pre-med at Northwestern, thanks to Rich's generosity. She comes to visit every month, and I've told her most of the truth. Most of it. I told her I embezzled money from the company to pay for experimental cancer treatments, that I was desperate and made terrible choices. She knows I disappointed Rich and broke his trust. But she doesn't know I tried to kill him." Grace nodded. "Sometimes mercy looks like protecting people from truths they don't need to carry." "Exactly. Sophie still loves me, still believes I'm a good man who made bad choices. That's a gift I don't deserve, but that I'm grateful for." Daniel reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. "This is why I asked you to come, Grace. I want you to meet someone." The photograph showed a young woman with Daniel's eyes and a brilliant smile, standing in front of what looked like a university building. She was beautiful, but more than that, she looked intelligent and kind. "Sophie's going to be a doctor," Daniel said, his voice filled with pride. "She wants to specialize in oncology, help other families facing what we've been through. She's everything I hoped she'd be, and more. She sounds wonderful." "She is. And Grace, I want you to know that she's heard about you, about what you did, how you saved Rich's life. She wants to meet you someday, to thank you for keeping her father from becoming a murderer." Grace felt overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it. She's going to need mentors, people who can show her what integrity looks like in the real world. You've already shown her father what he should have been." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the snow fall outside the window. Daniel looked frailer than when Grace had first seen him, but there was a peace in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I have something else to tell you," Daniel said. "About Rich. He's been coming to see me every month since the trial." Grace's eyes widened. "Really? Really? At first I thought he was coming to gloat, to see me suffer. But that's not who Rich is. He comes because he's still my friend, despite everything. He brings me books, updates about the company, news about Sophie's progress at school. That's very generous of him." "It's more than generous. It's grace. The unmerited favor you talked about before. I don't deserve his friendship, but he gives it anyway." Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious. "Grace, I want you to know that Rich has changed because of what you did. He's become more thoughtful, more aware of the people around him. He's instituted new policies at the company, programs to help employees facing personal crises. He doesn't want anyone else to feel so desperate that they resort to what I did. He's a good man. He is, and he's lucky to have you working for him. I hear you're excelling in your studies, that you'll be joining the company full-time after graduation." Grace smiled. "It's surreal sometimes. A year ago, I was serving coffee and worried about paying rent. Now I'm studying corporate ethics and preparing to help run a multi-billion-dollar company. That's not surreal. That's justice. You deserve every opportunity you've been given. A guard appeared at the door, signaling that visiting time was almost over. Daniel struggled to his feet, and Grace instinctively moved to help him. "Thank you," he said as she steadied him. "For everything. For stopping me. For forgiving me. For coming here today. You've shown me that even in the darkest moments, there are still people willing to do the right thing. Daniel, I have to ask, do you regret it? Not the crime, but everything. The whole situation." Daniel considered the question carefully. "I regret the pain I caused. I regret the betrayal, the lies, the fear I put you and Rich through, but..." He paused, looking at Sophie's photograph one more time. "I don't regret that it brought good people into my daughter's life. I don't regret that it showed me what real friendship looks like. And I don't regret that it led to you having the opportunities you have now. Even though it cost you everything. Grace, I was dying anyway. The cancer was going to take me whether I went to prison or not. At least this way. Something good came from something terrible. Sophie has a future. Rich has learned to appreciate the people around him, and you've found your calling. That's not nothing." As Grace prepared to leave, Daniel called out one last time. "Grace, when you see Rich, tell him something for me. Tell him that our friendship, the real friendship we had for 15 years, that was genuine. The betrayal was the cancer talking, the desperation and fear, but the love and respect I had for him, that was real. I'll tell him. And Grace, thank you for being the kind of person who risks everything to save strangers. The world needs more people like you." As Grace walked through the snow toward her car, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. A year ago, she'd been invisible, struggling to survive. Now she was preparing to graduate from Northwestern, to join Richard's company as a vice president of ethics and corporate responsibility. But more than that, she'd learned that sometimes the most important moments in life happened in the space between hearing something wrong and deciding to act. In that space, character was revealed and futures were determined. Daniel Brooks had made the wrong choice in that moment, but his mistake had led to redemption for everyone involved. Sometimes, Grace realized, even our worst failures could become the foundation for someone else's greatest success. 5 years later, the spring sunshine streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Caldwell Enterprises boardroom cast golden patterns across the polished mahogany table. Grace Rivera Caldwell, she'd hyphenated her name when she married Richard's younger brother Marcus 2 years ago, stood at the head of the table, addressing the company's senior executives with the confidence that had become her trademark. "Our employee assistance program has helped over 2,000 families in the past year alone," Grace announced. Clicking to the next slide of her presentation, "We've prevented 3 potential suicides, helped dozens of employees through cancer treatment, and provided emergency financial assistance to families facing crisis." The executives nodded approvingly. What had started as Grace's small initiative to help struggling employees had grown into a comprehensive program that other companies now studied and emulated. "The Daniel Brooks Memorial Fund," Grace continued, "has provided college scholarships to 43 children of employees facing terminal illness. We've learned that desperation breeds poor choices, but support breeds hope." Richard, now CEO and chairman of the board, smiled from his seat at the opposite end of the table. "Grace, this program has not only helped our employees, it's made us more profitable. Loyalty and productivity are at all-time highs. That's because we're treating people like human beings instead of just resources," Grace replied. "When employees know their company cares about them as individuals, they care about the company's success." After the meeting, Grace walked through the building that had become her second home. The Caldwell Enterprises headquarters had been redesigned to reflect the company's new values. Open spaces, natural light, and employee lounges that actually got used. But most importantly, Grace had insisted on placing suggestion boxes throughout the building, encouraging employees to report concerns about their colleagues' well-being. Mrs. Rivera Caldwell, a young woman, approached nervously. Grace recognized her as Jennifer, one of the newer accountants. "Could I speak with you privately?" "Of course. My office." Jennifer nodded, and they walked to Grace's corner office, which she deliberately designed to feel welcoming rather than intimidating. Family photos shared space with her Northwestern University diploma and the numerous awards the company had won for workplace excellence. "What's on your mind?" "Jennifer. It's about Mark in it. He's been different lately, missing deadlines, looking exhausted. And yesterday I heard him on the phone talking about medical bills. I'm worried about him, but I don't want to get him in trouble." Grace smiled. "You did exactly the right thing by coming to me. Let me talk to Mark, see if there's anything we can do to help." This was the part of her job Grace loved most. The personal connections, the opportunity to help people before they reached the breaking point that had consumed Daniel Brooks. She'd learned that most workplace problems were really life problems that spilled over into the office. An hour later, Grace knocked on Mark's cubicle. He looked up with bleary eyes, clearly struggling to focus on his computer screen. "Mark, do you have a few minutes to talk? Maybe grab some coffee?" "I'm really behind on the Johnson account, Mrs. Rivera Caldwell. Could we maybe—" "The Johnson account can wait. You look like you could use a break." In the employee lounge, over coffee and sandwiches, Mark's story emerged. His wife had been diagnosed with breast cancer, and despite their insurance, the treatment costs were overwhelming. He'd been working double shifts at a weekend job, barely sleeping, trying to keep up with both his work responsibilities and his family obligations. "Mark, why didn't you come to me sooner?" Grace asked gently. "We have programs specifically designed to help in situations like this." "I didn't want to seem like I couldn't handle my own problems," Mark admitted. "I didn't want to be seen as weak." Grace thought about Daniel Brooks, about the pride that had prevented him from asking for help until it was too late. Asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. "Let me make some calls." By the end of the day, Grace had arranged for Mark's wife to receive treatment at Northwestern Memorial, with the company covering the costs not handled by insurance. She'd also connected Mark with a counselor who specialized in helping families deal with cancer, and arranged for him to work flexible hours so he could attend his wife's appointments. "Mrs. Rivera Caldwell," Mark said, tears in his eyes, "how can I ever repay you? By taking care of your family and letting us help you succeed here. And Mark, if you ever notice a colleague struggling the way you've been struggling, speak up. That's how we take care of each other." That evening, Grace drove to the cemetery where Daniel Brooks had been buried 6 months earlier. The cancer had finally claimed him, but not before he'd seen his daughter graduate from medical school. Sophie was now a resident at Northwestern Memorial, specializing in oncology. Just as she'd planned, Grace placed fresh flowers on Daniel's grave, as she did every month. The headstone read simply, "Daniel Marcus Brooks, beloved father, complicated friend, human being." "Sophie got engaged," Grace said aloud, knowing it was silly, but feeling like Daniel should know, to a pediatric surgeon she met during her residency. They're planning a small ceremony next spring. Richard is going to walk her down the aisle. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of spring flowers. Grace had learned to find peace in these one-sided conversations with Daniel's memory. "I think you'd be proud of her. She's everything you hoped she'd be. Brilliant, compassionate, determined to help others. She's starting a research project on early detection methods for pancreatic cancer. She wants to make sure other families don't go through what you two did." Grace's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Dinner's ready when you are. Marcus brought wine. Don't be late. I'm making your favorite." Helen Rivera had thrived in the years since her transplant. She'd become the unofficial grandmother to the entire Caldwell family, hosting dinners and holiday celebrations in the guest house that had permanently become her home. Her recovery had been so complete that she'd started volunteering at the hospital, helping other patients navigate the transplant process. "I should go," Grace said to the headstone, "but I wanted you to know that the program we named after you helped another family today. That's 44 now. 44 families who won't have to face the desperation you faced." As Grace drove home through the Chicago streets, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, she'd been a waitress whose biggest dream was paying her mother's medical bills. Now she was a vice president of a Fortune 500 company, married to a man who shared her values, and in a position to help countless people avoid the tragic path Daniel had taken. But the most important lesson she'd learned was simpler than all the business strategies and corporate policies. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pay attention to the people around you and speak up when something seems wrong. Her phone rang as she pulled into the driveway. Sophie Brooks appeared on the screen, her face bright with happiness. "Grace, I wanted to tell you the news personally. The research grant came through. The Daniel Brooks Foundation is funding my pancreatic cancer research for the next 3 years. Sophie, that's wonderful. I know Dad would be so proud. We're going to save lives, Grace. We're going to make sure other families don't have to go through what we did. Your father would be incredibly proud. Grace agreed. And Sophie, he was right about one thing. You are going to change the world. After hanging up, Grace sat in her car for a moment, looking at the house where her mother was waiting with dinner, where her husband was probably telling Helen about his day, where the life she'd never dared to dream was waiting for her. She thought about the young woman who'd stood in that cafe 5 years ago, torn between fear and conscience, between safety and doing what was right. That woman had made a choice that changed everything, not just for herself, but for everyone whose life she'd touched. As Grace walked toward the house, she whispered the words that had become her personal motto, the phrase that had guided her through every difficult decision since that day in the Magnolia House. Sometimes angels don't have wings. They just have hearts brave enough to do what's right, even when it costs everything. The front door opened, and her mother's voice called out, "Mija, come in. You're home." Grace smiled, knowing that home wasn't just a place. It was the life you built when you had the courage to choose love over fear, justice over safety, and hope over despair. She was finally, truly home.